Have you ever looked at someone and made an instant judgment based solely on their appearance? We all have. It's human nature. But what happens when that split-second decision destroys not just someone's dignity, but reveals the ugly truth about our own prejudices? Today I'm going to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about judging people by their cover. It's about an elderly man who walked into a store on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning, wearing worn-out clothes and shuffling slowly through the aisles. To everyone watching, he looked like someone who didn't belong there, someone to keep an eye on, someone suspicious. But this wasn't just any man, and this wasn't just any store. What happened next shocked an entire community and sparked a conversation that spread across the nation. It's a story about dignity, respect, and the dangerous assumptions we make every single day. A story that proves that sometimes the person you least expect holds all the power. Stay with me, because this tale will change how you see the world around you, and I guarantee you'll never look at someone the same way again. Harold Thompson had been walking the same route every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years. At 78 years old, his daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Wake up at 6, black coffee with no sugar, read the morning paper, and then the walk. Always the walk. His neighbors in the modest Cleveland suburb barely noticed him anymore. To them, Harold was just another elderly man shuffling down Maple Street in his faded blue jacket, the one with the small tear near the left pocket that he'd been meaning to fix for months. His gray hair was often disheveled, his shoes worn down at the heels, and his clothes carried that lived-in look of someone who valued comfort over style. What they didn't know, what nobody bothered to ask, was that Harold had built his entire life from nothing. 50 years ago, he'd arrived in Cleveland with $37 in his pocket and a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except him. He'd worked 16-hour days, saved every penny, and slowly, methodically built something extraordinary. But Harold never talked about his success. He drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, shopped at discount grocery stores, and wore the same jacket season after season. To him, flashy displays of wealth were wasteful. He'd grown up during the Depression, and those lessons of frugality had never left him. Waste not, want not, his mother used to say. And Harold lived by those words even now, decades after achieving more than he'd ever imagined possible. On this particular Tuesday morning, Harold decided to make a detour. Instead of his usual route to the small corner market where Mrs. Chen always greeted him with a warm smile and asked about his arthritis, he turned left onto Commerce Street. There was something he needed to check on, something that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. The automatic doors of Premier Electronics slid open with a soft whoosh, and Harold stepped inside. The store was exactly as he remembered it from his last visit 6 months ago. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated rows of gleaming televisions, smartphones, and computers. The air smelled of new plastic and cleaning supplies, and soft background music played overhead. But something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that Harold couldn't quite place. He noticed the way conversations seemed to quiet as he passed, how eyes followed his movement through the store. Behind the customer service counter, 24-year-old Jessica Martinez was having the worst week of her career. 3 returns had gone wrong, her register had been short $40 the day before, and her manager, Mr. Stevens, had made it clear that her job was hanging by a thread. "One more mistake, Martinez, and you're out," he'd said that morning, his voice carrying that tone that made her stomach twist with anxiety. So when Jessica saw the elderly man in the worn jacket wandering slowly through the store, picking up items and examining them closely, every alarm bell in her head started ringing. She'd worked retail long enough to recognize the signs, or at least what she thought were the signs. The way he moved seemed purposeful but secretive. The way he handled the merchandise, turning items over in his hands, checking them from every angle. And most damning of all, the way he kept glancing around, as if making sure no one was watching. Jessica caught the eye of Marcus Williams, the store's security guard. Marcus was new to the job, only 3 weeks in, and he was eager to prove himself. At 26, he took his responsibilities seriously, maybe too seriously. He'd been a military police officer before this job, and he brought that same intensity to his work at Premier Electronics. Marcus had noticed the elderly man too. Something about the situation didn't feel right. The man's clothes suggested he couldn't afford the high-end electronics he was examining so carefully. A voice in Marcus's head, the same voice that had kept him safe during his deployment overseas, was telling him to pay attention. Harold, completely unaware of the surveillance, continued his inspection. He was particularly interested in the new display of tablets near the back of the store. The setup wasn't what he'd approved in the last planning meeting, and he wanted to understand why the layout had been changed. He picked up one of the tablets, a sleek model that retailed for nearly $800, and began examining it closely. The device felt solid in his hands, well built. He approved of the quality, even if the placement seemed odd to him. "Can I help you with something?" The voice came from behind him, sharp and suspicious. Harold turned to see Marcus approaching, his hand resting casually but deliberately on his radio. The security guard's posture was tense, ready for trouble. "Just looking," Harold replied quietly, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of age and a lifetime of cigarettes he'd quit 30 years too late. "That's a pretty expensive item you're holding there," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Harold's hands. "You planning on purchasing something today?" There was something in the guard's tone that made Harold's chest tighten. He'd heard that tone before, years ago, when he'd been the one wearing worn-out clothes and trying to prove he belonged in places where others thought he didn't. "I might be," Harold said simply, setting the tablet back down with careful precision. But Marcus interpreted the careful movement differently. To him, it looked like someone trying not to damage evidence, someone who'd been caught in the act and was now trying to play innocent. "Sir, I need to ask you to come with me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned in the military. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. "Excuse me? I said I need you to come with me. We need to have a conversation." The exchange was beginning to draw attention. Other customers were glancing over, some stopping their browsing entirely to see what was happening. Jessica watched from behind the counter, her heart racing with a mixture of vindication and anxiety. "About what?" Harold asked, his voice steady, but with an edge that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with authority. "About what you were planning to do with that tablet." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a familiar burning in his chest that took him back to a time when he'd been judged not by his character or his achievements, but by the threadbare clothes he wore and the humble neighborhood he called home. "I was looking at it," Harold said, his voice remaining calm despite the storm building inside him. "Last I checked, that wasn't a crime. The way you were looking at it, sir. The way you were handling it. I've been doing this job long enough to recognize suspicious behavior." Marcus was lying, of course. 3 weeks hardly qualified as long enough for anything, but his confidence in his assessment was absolute. He'd been trained to trust his instincts, and every instinct he had was screaming that this old man was trouble. Harold looked around the store, taking in the faces of the other customers, the way they were staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He saw Jessica behind the counter, her expression a perfect blend of suspicion and satisfaction, as if she'd caught a mouse in her trap. "And what exactly do you think I was planning to do?" Harold asked, his voice growing quieter, more dangerous. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, sir." The word "sir" was delivered with just enough sarcasm to make it clear that Marcus didn't mean it as a sign of respect. It was a challenge, a way of saying that Harold's age wouldn't protect him from scrutiny. Harold had built an empire by knowing when to fight and when to walk away. He'd learned to choose his battles carefully, to save his energy for conflicts that mattered. But standing in that store, feeling the weight of assumptions and prejudices pressing down on him like a physical force, he realized this was one of those moments when walking away wasn't an option. "Officer," Harold said, the word carrying its own subtle challenge, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, sir. I saw what I saw. Now, are you going to come with me voluntarily, or do we need to make this more difficult than it has to be?" The threat was implicit but clear. Harold could comply, or Marcus would make him comply. Around them, the store had gone almost completely quiet. Even the background music seemed to fade as customers and employees alike focused on the drama unfolding in aisle 7. Harold took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his 78 years in his bones. He thought about his late wife, Eleanor, and what she would have said about this moment. She'd always been the diplomat between them, the one who could smooth over conflicts with a smile and a gentle word. But Eleanor had been gone for 5 years now, and Harold was tired of being gentle. "I'm not going anywhere with you," he said quietly. Marcus's hand moved to his radio. "Sir, I'm asking you one more time to cooperate, and I'm telling you one more time that I haven't done anything wrong." The standoff was electric. Two men, separated by 50 years and completely different life experiences, staring at each other across a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. One saw a potential criminal who needed to be stopped. The other saw the same prejudice and assumptions he'd been fighting his entire life. Jessica decided this had gone on long enough. She picked up the store phone and dialed the extension for Mr. Stevens's office. This was exactly the kind of decisive action that might save her job. "Mr. Stevens, we have a situation on the floor. Marcus is dealing with a suspected shoplifter, but the man is refusing to cooperate." Within minutes, Mr. Stevens appeared, his face already arranged in the expression of professional concern he'd perfected during his 15 years in retail management. At 42, Richard Stevens had seen every kind of customer and every kind of problem. He prided himself on his ability to de-escalate situations quickly and efficiently. "What seems to be the problem here?" Stevens asked, his voice carrying the practiced authority of middle management. Marcus quickly explained his suspicions, describing Harold's behavior with the conviction of someone who'd witnessed a crime in progress. Harold listened to the account of his own actions, barely recognizing himself in Marcus's description. "Sir," Stevens said, turning to Harold with the same tone he might use with a difficult child, "I'm sure this is all just a big misunderstanding. If you could just come with us to the office, we can sort this out quickly and get you on your way." Harold looked at Stevens, taking in the man's perfectly pressed shirt, his confident smile, and his absolute certainty that he was handling the situation appropriately. "And if I refuse?" Harold asked. Stevens' smile faltered slightly. "Well, sir, I'd hate for this to become a bigger issue than it needs to be. We're trying to be reasonable here." "Reasonable," Harold repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. By now the confrontation had attracted a small crowd. Customers whispered to each other, some recording the scene with their phones. Harold could hear fragments of their conversations, assumptions being made, judgments being passed based on nothing more than his appearance, and the accusations being leveled against him. "Fine," Harold said finally, "but I want you to know that you're making a serious mistake." "I'm sure we can work everything out," Stevens replied, his relief evident. "Marcus, escort this gentleman to the office. I'll be right behind you." As they walked through the store, Harold felt the eyes of every customer and employee following him. He heard the whispers, saw the looks of disappointment and disgust on faces of people who'd decided his guilt based on nothing more than the word of a security guard and the assumptions of a store manager. The office was small and cramped, furnished with a metal desk, 2 plastic chairs, and a filing cabinet that had seen better days. On the walls hung motivational posters about teamwork and customer service that seemed almost comically out of place given the circumstances. Stevens sat behind the desk, assuming the position of authority, while Marcus stood by the door like a sentinel. Harold was offered one of the plastic chairs, but he remained standing. "Now then," Stevens began, pulling out a clipboard with incident forms. "Let's start with your name and address. Harold Thompson. And before we go any further, I want you to call your district manager." Stevens looked up from his clipboard, slightly annoyed by the interruption. "Sir, I don't think that's necessary. This is really just a routine matter." "Call him," Harold insisted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Stevens pause. "I'm perfectly capable of handling this situation myself," Stevens replied, his professional smile beginning to show cracks around the edges. Harold reached into his jacket pocket, a movement that made Marcus tense immediately. But instead of whatever threat the security guard was anticipating, Harold pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a business card, creased and faded from age, and placed it on Stevens's desk. Stevens glanced at the card dismissively, then did a double take. His face went pale as he read the name printed in simple black letters: Harold Thompson, founder and CEO, Thompson Retail Group. The silence in the room was deafening. Stevens stared at the card as if it might transform into something else if he looked at it long enough. "Marcus," sensing that something had shifted but not understanding what, looked back and forth between the two men with growing confusion. That's not possible, Stevens whispered. Harold reached into his wallet again and produced a driver's license, a credit card, and finally, a key card with the Premier Electronics logo prominently displayed. Harold Thompson, he said quietly, owner of Thompson Retail Group, which, as you might recall from your employee handbook, is the parent company that owns this store, and 37 others just like it. The color drained completely from Stevens's face. Marcus's mouth fell open as the implications began to sink in. Harold Thompson wasn't just some random customer they'd accused of shoplifting. He was their boss. The man who signed their paychecks. The man who could end their careers with a single phone call. Mr. Thompson, Stevens stammered, rising so quickly from his chair that he knocked over his coffee mug, sending brown liquid spreading across his desk. This is a mistake, Harold finished for him. A very serious mistake. Marcus felt his legs go weak. 3 weeks on the job, and he'd just accused the company owner of being a thief. His military training had taught him to own his mistakes, but this was beyond anything he'd ever imagined possible. Sir, Marcus began, his voice cracking slightly. I need to apologize. I had no idea who you were. Harold turned to look at the young security guard, seeing something in his face that gave him pause. There was genuine remorse there, not just fear of consequences, but real regret for his actions. And if I had been just some elderly customer browsing your store, Harold asked, would that have made your behavior acceptable? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus had no answer because there was no good answer. Harold was right, and they all knew it. Stevens was frantically trying to clean up the spilled coffee, his hands shaking as he dabbed at the papers on his desk. Mr. Thompson, please, let me explain. We've had some issues with theft lately and the staff has been on high alert. It was just a case of being overly cautious. Overly cautious, Harold repeated. Is that what you call humiliating a customer in front of the entire store? Is that what you call dragging someone to your office based on nothing more than the way they're dressed? Harold walked to the small window that looked out over the sales floor. He could see customers moving through the aisles, employees helping them find what they needed. Everyone going about their business as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that couldn't be undone with apologies or explanations. Mr. Thompson, Stevens tried again, I want you to know that this doesn't reflect our usual standards of customer service. We pride ourselves on treating everyone with respect and dignity. Harold laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you pride yourselves on judging people by their appearance and assuming the worst about anyone who doesn't fit your image of an ideal customer. The truth of his words was undeniable. Harold had been profiled, plain and simple. His age, his clothes, his appearance had all been used against him by people who were supposed to be serving customers, not investigating them. Marcus cleared his throat, his military training finally overriding his shock and embarrassment. Sir, you're absolutely right. There's no excuse for how I treated you. I made assumptions based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had. Harold turned to study the young man. There was something about Marcus's honesty, his willingness to acknowledge his mistake without making excuses, that reminded Harold of himself at that age. How long have you been working here? Harold asked. 3 weeks, sir. And before that? Military police, sir, 2 tours overseas. Harold nodded slowly. He understood now. Marcus wasn't a bad person, just someone who'd been trained to see threats everywhere. Someone who'd brought the wrong skills to the wrong job. And you, Stevens, how long have you been managing this store? 4 years, Mr. Thompson. And I want you to know that my record has been exemplary. Customer satisfaction scores, profit margins, employee retention. Stop, Harold said quietly. Just stop. Stevens's mouth snapped shut. Harold moved away from the window and sat down in one of the plastic chairs, suddenly feeling every one of his 78 years. The anger was still there, burning in his chest, but it was being tempered by something else. Sadness, maybe, or disappointment. Do you want to know why I was in your store today? Harold asked. Neither man answered, but both leaned forward slightly, eager to understand. I was checking on the new tablet display. I'd approved a different layout in our last board meeting and I wanted to see why it had been changed. I was examining the tablets because I wanted to understand the customer experience, to see if the new positioning made sense from a practical standpoint. Stevens closed his eyes, the full weight of his mistake finally hitting him. I come into our stores regularly, Harold continued. Not announced, not with fanfare. Just a customer seeing how we treat people, how we run our business. It's something I've been doing for 30 years. Harold paused, letting that sink in. In all those years, in hundreds of visits to dozens of stores, I have never, not once, been treated the way I was treated here today. The silence that followed was crushing. Stevens stared at his hands. Marcus stood at attention despite being in civilian clothes, and Harold sat quietly, processing everything that had happened. What happens now? Stevens asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold considered the question carefully. What did happen now? He had the power to fire both men, to make their lives significantly more difficult. He could demand public apologies, policy changes, sensitivity training. He could turn this incident into a company-wide teaching moment about prejudice and customer service. But Harold had learned something important during his 78 years on Earth. Revenge felt good in the moment, but it rarely led to lasting change. And change was what was needed here, not punishment. What happens now, Harold said slowly, is that you both learn from this. You, Marcus, learn that being a good security guard isn't about assuming everyone is a criminal. It's about watching for actual suspicious behavior, not profiling people based on how they look. Marcus nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. And you, Stevens, learn that customer service means serving all customers, not just the ones who look like they can afford to shop here. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect and dignity, regardless of how much money they have or what they're wearing. Yes, Mr. Thompson, absolutely. Harold stood up, feeling older than he had when he'd walked into the store an hour earlier. I'm not going to fire either of you, but I am going to be watching this store and both of you very carefully. He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. And I want you to think about something. If you can treat the owner of your company the way you treated me today, how do you think you're treating customers who have no power, no recourse, no way to make you accountable for your actions? The question lingered in the air as Harold opened the door and walked back onto the sales floor. Customers and employees alike watched him pass, many of them recognizing him as the man who'd been escorted to the office under suspicion of shoplifting. But Harold walked differently now. His shoulders were straighter, his stride more purposeful. He was no longer the suspicious old man in worn clothes. He was Harold Thompson, and even though most people in the store still didn't know his name, something about his demeanor had changed everything. Jessica watched from behind the customer service counter as Harold approached. She'd heard whispers about what had happened in the office, rumors that the old man wasn't what he'd seemed. But she wasn't sure what to believe. Excuse me, Harold said, stopping at her counter. Jessica's heart began to race. Yes, sir. I'd like to speak with you for a moment. Jessica glanced around nervously, looking for support that wasn't coming. About what? About assumptions, Harold said simply. About the assumptions you made about me today. Jessica felt her face flush. I was just doing my job, sir. Were you? Because from where I stood, it looked like you were judging me based on my appearance and deciding I was a criminal before I'd done anything wrong. The truth of his words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She had done exactly that. She'd seen an elderly man in worn clothes and immediately assumed the worst. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I didn't mean. But you did mean it, Harold said, not unkindly. Maybe not consciously, but you looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong, someone to be suspicious of. And that's something you need to think about. Harold reached into his wallet again and pulled out another business card, this one crisp and new. He placed it on the counter in front of Jessica. My name is Harold Thompson. I own this store, and 37 others like it. But more importantly, I'm a human being who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, just like every other customer who walks through those doors. Jessica stared at the card, her hands shaking as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. I don't want an apology, Harold continued. Apologies are just words. What I want is for you to remember this moment the next time you see someone who doesn't look like your idea of a typical customer. I want you to remember that you have no idea who that person is, what they've accomplished, or what they might be going through. Harold turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at Jessica one more time. And I want you to remember that how you treat people says nothing about them, but everything about you. As Harold walked toward the exit, conversation stopped and heads turned. Word was spreading quickly through the store about what had really happened, about who the elderly man in the worn jacket really was. Some customers looked embarrassed, remembering their own assumptions and judgments. Others seemed confused, unable to reconcile the Harold Thompson they'd heard about with the man they'd seen being escorted to the manager's office. But Harold didn't stop to explain or to accept apologies. He walked straight to the exit, his head held high, leaving behind a store full of people who were suddenly questioning everything they thought they knew about appearances and assumptions. Outside, Harold paused on the sidewalk and took a deep breath of fresh air. The confrontation had drained him emotionally, but it had also reminded him of something important. Despite all his success, despite all he'd accomplished, he was still the same person he'd always been. Someone who'd been underestimated and prejudged his entire life. Someone who'd learned to prove his worth through actions rather than appearances. Harold pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Sarah? It's Harold." "Yes, I'm fine. Listen, I need you to schedule a meeting with all the district managers. We need to talk about customer service training, sensitivity training, and the way we treat people in our stores." He paused, listening to his assistant's questions. "What happened?" "Let's just say I had a reminder today about why it's important to treat every customer like they might be the most important person you'll meet." As Harold walked back toward his car, he thought about the young security guard, Marcus, and his obvious remorse. He thought about Stevens, the manager who'd been so focused on protecting his store that he'd forgotten about protecting people's dignity. And he thought about Jessica, the young woman behind the counter whose assumptions had started the whole incident. They weren't bad people, Harold realized. They were just people who'd never been forced to confront their own prejudices, never been made to understand how their assumptions affected others. But now they had been. And while Harold couldn't undo what had happened, he could make sure it led to something positive, something that would make a difference for future customers who might not have his resources or his ability to fight back. 6 months later, Harold Thompson made another unannounced visit to Premier Electronics. This time, he wore the same worn jacket and shuffled through the aisles in the same unhurried way. But this time, the response was different. Marcus, still working as a security guard but now with additional training in customer service and bias recognition, nodded politely as Harold entered but made no assumptions about his intentions. Stevens, who had implemented new training protocols for all staff, focused on helping customers rather than judging them. And Jessica, who had become one of the store's most empathetic and effective customer service representatives, greeted Harold with a warm smile and asked if there was anything she could help him find. Harold smiled and declined the offer of help, but he made a mental note to include the store's transformation in his next board report. Change was possible, but only when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their assumptions. As he browsed the store that day, Harold reflected on the lesson that his humiliating experience had taught him, and hopefully taught others. We live in a world where we're constantly making split-second judgments about people based on limited information. What someone wears, how they speak, where they come from, what they look like, all of these factors influence how we treat them, often without us even realizing it. But every person we encounter has a story, struggles we know nothing about, achievements we can't see, and a fundamental right to be treated with dignity and respect. The elderly man in worn clothes might be a company owner. The young woman with tattoos might be a brilliant scientist. The teenager in baggy clothes might be a volunteer at a homeless shelter. We never really know who we're dealing with, which means we should treat everyone as if they might be the most important person we'll meet that day. Because sometimes they are. Harold's story spread far beyond the walls of that single electronics store. It became a reminder that respect and dignity aren't earned by wealth or status. They're owed to every human being simply because they're human. It's a lesson that applies whether you're a security guard, a store manager, a customer service representative, or just someone trying to navigate the world with kindness and understanding. The next time you see someone who doesn't fit your expectations, remember Harold Thompson. Remember that appearances can be deceiving, that assumptions can be dangerous, and that treating people with respect costs you nothing but can mean everything to them. Because in the end, how we treat others when we think it doesn't matter is exactly when it matters most. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own assumptions and prejudices, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, every interaction you have is a chance to choose kindness over judgment, understanding over assumption, and respect over prejudice. The choice is always yours.